The Kurdish-led administration in northeast Syria is holding thousands of people from over 50 countries accused of being involved with ISIS. For months, they've been urging other countries, including this one, to take back their ISIS fighters, but that hasn't happened. Now, The Guardian newspaper is reporting that the Kurdish-led administration is going to put those ISIS fighters on trial themselves. Does this let countries like Canada off the hook? Leah West is a lecturer of national security and intelligence at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. She's also a former national security lawyer at the Department of Justice. Hi, Leah.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
So,
can you help us interpret this news?
Yes.
I mean, this is what The Guardian is reporting, but does this basically let Canada off the hook?
No, I don't think so. For a couple of reasons. The trials that would be held by the Autonomous Administration in northeastern Syria are not what we would typically think of as prosecution or war crimes trials. The ones that they've been holding for local fighters, reported by NPR, for example, are 3 people sitting behind a table in a room with an individual who's being accused. There's no defense. There's no witnesses. It's evidence that's been gathered by Kurdish forces, for example, put to the witness. They have a conversation and then they sentence them. So that's not what we would typically think of as a trial that respects international human rights law, for example. So the other big part of that is that the Kurdish judges have been taking a restorative approach. So the sentences they've been issuing have been actually quite low. Unless you are a fighter or a senior fighter, you're not getting life in prison.
What are you getting?
Most people have been that were kind of co-opted into the group are getting less than a year. Those who served in kind of administrative roles or other low-level roles are getting between 1 and 5 years. So realistically, I see this as a way of the Autonomous Administration actually getting these people out of their country.
Well, that's what they've been wanting to do for a while, right? They have been asking Canada and other countries, urging them, take people back. You can prosecute them. We're not equipped to take care of this.
Right. And so we've got 15 women, for example, that are in Kurdish custody right now, say that they were prosecuted for whatever roles that they played. We don't have any reason to believe that they were senior figures in the organization, so they could get a few years. Once they've served their sentence, there's nothing. They certainly won't be staying in Syria. They wouldn't have any grounds to stay in Syria. And there's no reason for them to not be able to return to Canada. As Canadian citizens, they have a constitutional right to return to this country.
Even if they've served time or if they've been convicted of a crime?
Correct. As Canadian citizens, just because you've been committed of a crime, once you've served your time, you are able to return to this country. Those who are not citizens, for example, those that are just connected to Canada through permanent residence, for example, that would be different. But for those who are citizens, which are the majority of the adults we've been talking about over the last year, they would have every right to return to Canada.
I want to read to you, our producer Brennan reached out to the federal government to get their reaction to this report. And I'm just going to read a portion of it. The government of Canada is aware of Canadian citizens being detained in Syria and is particularly concerned with the cases of Canadian children in Syria. We've reached out to Syrian Kurdish officials to seek information on Canadians in Syria. We continue to monitor the situation very closely. So nothing really on the substance of whether or not this is okay or if Canada plans on doing more. We know in the past, and we've had this conversation before, that the government has expressed a lot of hesitancy in getting involved, in sending Canadian officials into that area, that it's too dangerous, and expressed some worry at least also about the difficulties in prosecuting these crimes and securing the evidence necessary to do so in Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that statement speaks to another important thing, is prosecuting the adults doesn't change the fact that there are 25 Canadian children in detention. What happens to them if their parents are convicted and sentenced to serve prison time in Syria? That's completely unknown. We don't know what would happen to them. The Kurdish administration has been hammering repeatedly that they want these individuals repatriated. And there are repeatedly, even now, even since the Turkish invasion, there continues to be children who are repatriated, but Canada hasn't taken any steps to repatriate any Canadian children. And they continually say that it is too dangerous to do so, despite the fact that a myriad of other countries have taken steps to repatriate their own children.
Is there, from an optics perspective, this is political to a certain degree. And I remember interviewing the former Public Safety Minister often, Ralph Goodale, on this, who was very hesitant. Like, if you made the decision to go over there, sorry, this was your decision. It was obviously the wrong one, and it's not really and I'm paraphrasing, but it's not really on us to go rescue you. Obviously, there is a different consideration when it comes to the kids, but we really never had any clear answers on how that might be addressed.
No, and most countries are, even those who are repatriating, aren't taking large swaths, at least not Western democratic countries. We've seen countries like Kazakhstan repatriate 500 people wholesale. But in terms of Western countries, it's been slower. Very oftentimes, children who are ill or are orphaned have been brought home. But even there is a Canadian orphan, a 4 or 5-year-old girl named Amara, who is in camps, and there's been no efforts to bring her home either. So it's hard to see the negative political optics about returning an orphan who's left in a dire situation in Syria, but there's been no movement on the Canadian government's part.
The government's perspective so far has been that there's also no legal obligation to do so. What is your interpretation of that?
So in terms of the children, I don't think that that's accurate. In terms of doing things that are in the best interest of the child, the government not taking action, especially when you're talking about an orphan, is action in and of itself, and it's not an action that is in the best interest of that orphan's life. And so in terms of the children, there is an obligation for the state to do what's in the best interest of those children. There is certainly no obligation legally to bring the adults home. But we're now in a situation where these adults may be prosecuted in contravention of international human rights law. And if we don't bring them home, they may come home on their own anyways. And once they've come home, whether or not they'll be able to be prosecuted here for different types of crimes, whether they'll be barred from that under double jeopardy, or whether they'll just go back to their lives without kind of any really programmed reintegration is something that I'd rather see the government take control from step one all the way through reintegration and rehabilitation, rather than having to deal with this in drips and drabs as people end up back on our doorstep.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Leah. Appreciate it as
Thank
always.
you.
Leah West of Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.